She told me about your father.
6 words from a man I had spoken to exactly twice in my life. What he repeated so comfortably was something I had said out loud only once in the dark to one person, and I had needed that person to be the only one who carried it. He believed he was closing a negotiation. What he was actually doing was telling me how long the two of them had been talking and about what. Neither of them noticed that I set the flowers down gently instead of dropping them. Neither of them asked what call I was expecting the next morning. If stories like this one hold you all the way to the end, consider subscribing before we go further, because what happened in that room was only the first hour of it. There is a great deal still ahead, and none of it went the way anyone expected. 2 days before I stood in that conference room holding flowers, I was a man who believed he had already gotten lucky. I worked in systems consulting, which mostly meant that companies called me when something they depended on had quietly stopped working, and nobody could explain why. I spent my days inside other people's broken infrastructure, tracing a failure backward through years of small decisions, until I found the one that started it, and I was genuinely good at that. It paid well enough. It never paid the way Sabrina's world paid. The thing I never once thought to do was run that same process on my own house. Sabrina sold penthouses she would never live in, and she had been doing it since long before I met her. She could stand in a marble entryway with a client and describe a view like she owned it, and by the end of the tour, they believed she did. She was 35, and she had spent 10 years being welcomed into rooms. She was not quite a member of always as the woman who could get you the property, never as the woman who could buy it. I understood that hunger. I thought I understood what it cost her, which is a different thing entirely. We had been married 7 years. I met her when she was still renting a studio with a radiator that clanked all winter, and our first apartment together had a heating system that failed twice in the first month. We ate instant noodles on the floor because we had no table yet, and she laughed so hard that night that she cried. And I remember thinking this was what people meant when they said they had found the right one. I told that story at dinner parties for years. She stopped telling it somewhere around year 5, and I noticed, and I decided people simply get tired of their own stories. Here is the flaw in me, and I want to say it plainly, because everything that came afterward grew out of it. I believed loyalty was reciprocal by nature. I believed that if I was faithful, faithfulness would be handed back to me the way a cashier hands back change. It never once occurred to me that my loyalty was something I was giving away rather than something I was trading. A man who thinks that way does not check. He does not look twice at a phone lying face down on a counter, and he does not ask why a client showing requires a Saturday. I had met Damian Kessler twice. Once at a holiday party where he shook my hand for 4 seconds and looked over my shoulder the entire time, and once in the lobby of her building. When I came to pick her up and he walked past us into an elevator without slowing down. That was the sum total of it. 2 encounters, neither of them longer than a minute, with a man who would eventually know more about the inside of my marriage than my own brother did. There is one more thing I gave her, and you need to know about it now because it came back to me across a conference table like it was nothing at all. My father died at 59. What killed him took his name from him first, then his hands, then the way he used to hum while he shaved, and by the end he looked at me the way you look at a stranger who has been kind to you for reasons you cannot remember. Early onset, the doctors called it. That phrase means it can be inherited. It means that a man in his late 30s who cannot find his keys does not experience that the way other men do, and it means there is a specific kind of cold that arrives in your chest when you lose a word in the middle of a sentence. I told Sabrina in the 3rd year of our marriage, sometime past 2 in the morning in the dark with my back to her because I could not say it to her face. She put her hand on my shoulder and told me she would be there either way. I believed that too. For 4 years afterward, every time that cold arrived, I thought about her hand on my shoulder and it steadied me. That secret was the most expensive thing I owned, and I had put every bit of it in one place. The last 6 months were full of information I refused to process. She came home later, and the lateness had a smoothness to it that new lies do not usually have. Her phone lived face down on every surface in our home. There were weekend showings that never seemed to produce a sale, and there was a cologne I did not recognize that she explained once unprompted before I had asked her anything at all. That is the detail that stays with me. She answered a question I had never asked, and I did not hear the sound of it because I had already decided that everything unusual in our life could be filed under stress and long hours. Then came Wednesday and a gas station off the interstate on the way home from a client site. I bought a coffee that was already burnt and a lottery ticket the way a man buys gum without any decision being made, and I put it in my jacket pocket and forgot it existed. I want to be clear that I was never a man who dreamed about winning. I had a mortgage, a car with 90,000 miles on it, and a wife I intended to grow old beside if the thing in my blood allowed it. Thursday I worked until almost midnight on a failure at a distribution center, the kind where 3 systems each function perfectly, and the combination of them does not. When I finally got home, the apartment was dark and Sabrina was already asleep or doing a convincing job of it. I hung up my jacket, felt the ticket in the pocket, and sat down at the kitchen counter with every light off except the one over the stove. It was 11:40 at night. I checked the numbers on my phone and read them wrong because that is what a mind does. It protects you from foolish hope by assuming you made an error. So I checked again. Then I turned the overhead light on and checked a third time out loud, moving my finger across each number the way a child reads. Then I turned the light off, sat in the dark for a while, turned it back on, and checked a fourth time. $80 million. I did not shout and I did not wake her. What I felt was not joy exactly. It was closer to vertigo, the floor of my life, dropping 2 feet without warning, and my first coherent thought was not about the money at all. It was about her face. I had spent 7 years watching that woman stand at the edges of rooms she was not invited into, and I was about to hand her a key to every one of them, and I was going to be the man who did it. She turned over at some point and asked, half asleep, whether I was coming to bed. I told her soon. I sat at that counter until nearly 3 in the morning doing arithmetic that did not need doing, and she was asleep 11 feet away from me, and I did not know that she had already ended us in an office downtown with her own signature. Friday morning, I called the state lottery office at 9 o'clock. The woman who took my call was very calm, which told me she had made this call many times before. She confirmed the ticket, walked me through verification, and then said the thing that shaped my entire day. Say nothing to anyone yet. Not friends, not coworkers, not extended family. There would be counsel, there would be a claim process, and until it was complete, the fewer people who knew, the more protected I would be. I asked whether that included my wife, and I remember laughing a little when she said that was my decision, because it did not feel like a decision at all. Before we hung up, she gave me a name. Gregory Hale, an attorney. The office referred winners to someone accustomed to sudden money and the people it attracts. I wrote it on the back of a receipt and put it in my wallet and did not call him because a man who has just won $80 million does not believe he needs a lawyer that same afternoon. That receipt sat folded in my wallet for the next 9 hours while my life came apart around it. By 11:30, a financial advisor had been assigned to me, a man with an efficient voice who explained the disbursement structure twice because I asked him to. He set my signing appointment for Saturday morning. Documents, identification, tax, withholding, elections. When we finished, he asked whether I had anyone helping me think through the coming months, and I told him my wife would. Those were my exact words, and I said them with complete confidence. I did not go into the office that day. I drove downtown instead to a jewelry store 2 blocks from her building because there was a necklace in that window Sabrina had stopped in front of 3 separate times over the years. Not once had she asked for it. That was the thing about her I loved most and understood least. She would look at something she wanted for a long moment, then say something dismissive about it and keep walking. And every time she did it, something in my chest tightened because I could not close the distance between what she wanted and what I could give her. I bought it at 2 o'clock. The woman behind the counter asked if it was for an occasion, and I said yes without explaining, and she set it in a box and left the lid off while I sat in my car in the lot and wrote the card. 6 lines. I am not going to repeat what I wrote. I will only say that it was about all the years she had spent standing outside rooms, and that she would never have to do that again, and that when my hand was moving, I meant every word of it. I put the card inside, closed the box, and tied the ribbon myself, and that box stayed sealed for the rest of the story. Then I bought the largest arrangement the florist had, the one that is too big to see over properly, and I drove to her office without calling ahead. I got there at 4:45 that soft hour on a Friday when a building has already begun emptying, and the people still at their desks are watching the clock. The young woman at the front desk stood up the moment she saw me. Her name was Claire Bennett, and I knew her the way you know the people at the edges of your spouse's working life. A face and a first name and 3 exchanges about the weather across 4 years. She stood up fast enough that her chair rolled back and struck the wall behind her, and she said my name twice. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, wait. I lifted the flowers so she could see them over the counter and told her it was a surprise and that I knew the way. I was already walking. I have gone back to that moment more times than I can count, and it looks the same every time. She was not confused about visitor policy. She was 26 years old, and she was trying to get in front of me before I reached that hallway, and I walked around her because I was too happy to hear what a stranger was trying to tell me. There were perhaps a dozen people still on the open floor. 3 of them looked up as I came through, then looked at each other, then looked down at their screens, and nobody said a word. I passed the corner office with its door standing open, and on the desk inside there was a framed photograph of Damien Kessler with a woman and 2 children on a dock somewhere, the kind of picture a man keeps where clients can see it. I registered all of it as slightly strange and kept moving because I was rehearsing. I had a sentence ready. I had been building it since 11:40 the night before, and I wanted to deliver it exactly right. The conference room at the end of that hall has a glass wall. Somebody chose that years ago, probably to signal transparency, and I have thought about the irony of it more than is healthy. Sabrina was standing in the middle of that room with Damien Kessler's hand on the small of her back. I want to be precise about what I understood in the first second because it was not what people assume. It was not the kiss. It was the ease. There was no urgency in either of them, no listening for footsteps, no glance toward the door. His hand knew exactly where it belonged, and she leaned into it the way you lean into a chair you have sat in 1,000 times. You cannot fake months. A man who traces failures backward for a living looks at something like that and knows immediately he is not watching the beginning of anything. Then I saw the table. There was a coffee cup still steaming beside an open folder, and even through the glass I could read the header across the top of the first page and the 2 names printed beneath it. Divorce consultation. Sabrina Vale. Nolan Pierce. So I stood in that hallway holding $80 million in my pocket and a bouquet I could barely see over, and I understood that my wife had not simply been unfaithful. She had been building an exit quietly on paper while coming home every evening and asking me how my day went and listening to the answer. Sabrina turned toward the glass and saw me. Damien's hand came off her back without hurry, the way a man moves when he has never once in his life been genuinely caught at anything. And for the first time in 7 years, standing there with my mouth already open around a sentence, I would now never say, I made a choice I had never had to make before. I chose to believe what my eyes had just shown me instead of whatever explanation was already walking toward that door to meet me. Sabrina opened the conference room door, and the first thing out of her mouth was that this was not what it looked like. I have thought a great deal about why she chose those words. She had weeks to prepare a sentence, and that was the one she reached for, which tells me she had rehearsed leaving, but had never once rehearsed being caught. Those are entirely different scripts. She stood in the doorway with her hand still on the handle and her voice climbing at the end of the sentence and behind her. Damien Kessler was settling back into his chair, buttoning nothing, adjusting nothing, completely at rest in a room where a man had just found his wife. I walked past her and set the flowers down on the table carefully beside the coffee cup that was still giving off steam. It was a heavy arrangement, and I remember thinking that if I dropped it, the water would go everywhere and someone would have to clean it up, and that a version of me who did that would be a version of me they could talk about afterward. So I put it down gently, and the sound it made was almost nothing, and Sabrina flinched at it harder than she would have flinched at anything I could have thrown. That was the first thing I learned that afternoon. Calm frightens people who are braced for a fight because a fight has rules they understand. A man who shouts is a man still negotiating. Standing over the table, I saw what the glass had kept from me. In the upper corner of the first page, in the small gray typeface law offices use for their own records, there was a date, 7 weeks earlier. Beneath it, the name of the attorney she had retained a firm 4 blocks from the building I was standing in. I did the arithmetic where I stood. 49 days. Every dinner she had eaten across from me in that time. Every night she had asked about my day and listened to the answer. Every morning she had kissed me on the way out the door with that engagement already signed and sitting in a drawer downtown. What was on that table was not the record of a mistake made on some difficult afternoon. It was the record of a decision made once and then made again every single morning for 7 weeks while she asked me whether I wanted coffee. Damien began to talk about the marriage. Not to me exactly, but around me the way a man discusses a property being sold whether or not the current tenant agrees. He said the marriage had been in trouble for a long time, and he said it with the confidence of a man reading from a report someone else had compiled for him. That confidence was itself the injury. He was not speculating. He had been briefed. I asked him how long he had known her. He told me the question was not relevant, and then in the same breath he told me that some men are a phase and that I had simply been a long one. He said it the way you would say something about the weather. Sabrina did not correct him because correcting him would have required admitting how much of our life she had already handed over. Then he pushed the folder toward me across the table and told me to sign it and save myself a lawyer's fee. I did not touch it. I looked at the date again instead because that is a habit from my work. When a number tells you something you do not want to be true, you do not argue with it. You verify it and you accept it, and then you follow it back to where it started. Sabrina told him to stop, and there was real fear in her voice, which I found interesting because until that moment she had been afraid of me, and now she was afraid of him. That was when Damien Kessler smiled at me comfortably, almost warmly, and said that she had told him about my father. I want to be exact about what happened inside me, because it was not what anyone would expect. There was no explosion. What I felt was closer to a door closing very quietly in a distant part of a house. He said those words as small talk. He offered them the way you might mention that a man's wife is a vegetarian, a harmless detail picked up over time, and that casualness told me everything I had spent 6 months refusing to know. Because a woman does not hand a man that particular piece of her husband in a hotel room. That is not something you say in the middle of an affair. That is something you say afterward at 2 in the morning when you are telling someone who you really are and what you are really carrying. My wife had been telling this man who she really was for long enough that my father's death had become one of his casual references. She had not only given him her body, she had given him the thing I said once in the dark with my back turned, and she had given it to a man who thought it was worth mentioning in order to score a point. Sabrina said my name. She had gone very white, and I understood that she had grasped before Damien had what he had just handed over. Then she started explaining, and the explanation had a shape I recognized from years of listening to people describe why a system had failed. I worked too much. She had been alone in that apartment for entire evenings. She had felt like furniture in my life. Damien was simply there, simply listening, and none of it was planned, and none of it was something she had gone looking for. I let her finish, and then I asked her to explain the date in the corner of the page. She had no answer for that because there is no version of that sentence which survives a date. A woman swept up in something does not sit in an attorney's office 7 weeks before and put her signature on an engagement letter. I took out my phone and photographed the header, then the corner with the date and the firm's name, then the signature page. Damien watched me do it and said nothing at all because he could not conceive of a world in which paperwork he had been careless with would ever matter to him. Sabrina reached over and pulled the folder against her chest like it was something private of hers that I had violated, which I suppose in her mind it was. Then I walked out. I did not slam anything. I crossed that open floor with its dozen people, every one of them now studying their screens with tremendous concentration, and Claire Bennett was standing behind the front desk with her hand over her mouth. I did not stop. I took the stairs because I did not want to stand in an elevator with anyone, and I went down 2 levels to the garage where I had left my car. They followed me. Both of them. That is the detail I keep returning to. Sabrina followed me because she wanted something. Damien followed her because he was not going to allow her to go anywhere without him. And he came down into that concrete garage in his shirt sleeves with his phone still in his hand. A man who had never in his life had to chase anything, and was irritated to find himself doing it now. Sabrina had the folder under one arm with her handbag still clutching it as though the paper itself was the thing she needed to protect. They caught up with me somewhere between the elevator bank and my car, and she was telling me we had to discuss this properly at home, that I was making permanent decisions in the worst hour of my life. Then my phone rang. I answered it because I assumed it was a client, and that is the only reason. I had my keys in one hand and the phone in the other, and I put it on speaker to free a hand without any thought at all about who was standing near me. It was the financial advisor confirming Saturday morning. He said the disbursement structure was in order. He read back the appointment time, and he said the words $80 million out loud into a concrete parking garage on a Friday afternoon twice because he was reading from a document and being thorough. I ended the call, and for a moment nobody said anything. Damien had stopped moving entirely. He was looking at me the way a man looks at a stranger who has just been introduced with a title he was not expecting. And Sabrina's face changed. I need to be understood here because this is the hinge that the rest of my life turned on. I was not watching a woman receive good news. I was watching a woman recalculate. 3 minutes earlier, she had been building a careful case for why our marriage had ended, listing the ways I had failed to be present inside it, and I had been standing there letting her do it. Now that file was closed, and a different one was open. She said we could not throw away 7 years like this. 9 seconds. I know it was 9 seconds because I have gone over that moment enough times to count it. 9 seconds between a number spoken by a stranger on speakerphone and my wife telling me our marriage was worth saving. Until then, there had been a question in my chest that I had carried since the hallway, and the question was whether she had ever loved me at all. That question died in the garage, and it was replaced by a colder one that has never entirely left me. If that call had never come through, would she be standing here? Everything about her was different now. Her voice, her hands, the distance she was willing to close. The folder, she said, was only a consultation, and people consult attorneys all the time and never file. She had been frightened and lonely, and she had wanted to know what her options were, the way you look up a symptom without believing you have the disease. She had never actually decided anything. Then she started on the years. She talked about the radiator that failed twice in that first month, and the night we ate noodles on the floor because we had no table. She talked about her mother's last week and about what I said to her in that hospital corridor at 4 in the morning, and she said it back to me almost word for word, which meant she had kept it all this time. I want to be honest about this part because it is the only stretch of that day where I was genuinely in danger. I nearly bent. 7 years does not evaporate in 40 minutes, and something happens when a person recites your own life back to you in your own words. Some animal part of you recognizes the sound and starts moving toward it before the rest of you can object. I stood in that garage with my keys in my hand and felt the pull of the easier road, the one where I let her finish and let her come home and let this become a thing we survived and referred to obliquely for the next 30 years. And then Damien Kessler, who had been standing there the entire time with no idea what was happening in front of him, spoke. He asked her with a kind of confused impatience why she was doing this when she had told him she would tell me tonight. He was not trying to destroy her. He genuinely did not understand that he had just done it. He was a man watching a transaction renegotiate itself for reasons nobody had explained to him, and he wanted the schedule honored. Sabrina turned on him so fast that her heels scraped against the concrete, and she told him to shut up, and it was already far too late. There had been a tonight, a specific evening, a chosen hour, probably a chosen restaurant or a chosen chair in our own living room. She had known that morning when she kissed me goodbye at the door, that by 10 o'clock that evening I would be a man being told his marriage was over. And I had spent that same day buying her a necklace and writing 6 lines on a card. So I asked her the only question left worth asking. If I had not walked into that building at 4:45, what exactly was she going to say to me tonight? She did not answer. Damien did not answer either, and his silence was easier to read than hers, because he had already worked out that anything he said next would cost him something. That silence was the answer, and inside it 2 things arrived in me at once. The first was that without a lottery ticket bought at a gas station on a Wednesday, I would have driven home that evening and sat down across from a woman who had the ending of our marriage already folded into her handbag, and I would have asked about her day first. I know myself well enough to be certain of that. The second was worse, and it is the one that closed the door. If she had already decided to end this before she knew about the money, and the date in her own handwriting said she had then nothing. She had said since that phone call was a woman fighting for her marriage. It was a woman revising a position. Damien's car was parked 4 spaces down, a dark sedan with the lights still blinking from when he had unlocked it out of habit. I took the folder out of Sabrina's hands and she let me. I walked over and laid it flat on the hood of his car under the garage lights, and I took off my wedding ring and set it down on top of the page with her signature on it. I did not throw anything, and I never touched Damien Kessler, and I have never once regretted that. I got into my own car and left the two of them standing there with my marriage lying on his hood between them. It ended in that garage, and not for the reason anyone watching would have assumed. It did not end because I had lost my wife. It ended because I finally understood that the woman I believed I had been married to for 7 years might never have existed in the way I needed her to. She came home at 10 o'clock that night. I heard her key in the door, and I did not get up. I was sitting at the kitchen counter under the same stove light I had sat under 2 nights earlier, and the box from the jewelry store was on the counter in front of me, still tied exactly as I had left it when I walked in 4.5 hours before. I had not opened it since I sealed the card inside it in that parking lot on Friday afternoon, and I did not open it now. There were no employees this time. No open floor of people studying their screens. No Damien Kessler standing in his shirt sleeves waiting for a schedule to be honored. For the first time in 6 months, it was only the two of us, and the truth in a kitchen where she had asked me about my day 400 times while carrying an attorney's engagement letter in her bag. She began by telling me I was moving too fast. Nobody should make permanent decisions inside the first 6 hours of anything, she said. I was in shock. I had not slept properly in 2 days, and it was showing. Everything she said in those first minutes was reasonable, and every reasonable thing she said served the same purpose, which was to buy time until I stopped being certain. Then she told me she still loved me. I asked her whether that was before or after $80 million. She told me that was cruel. She did not tell me it was false. I have replayed that exchange more than any other from that night because I handed her the simplest opening a person can be given. 1 syllable would have covered it, and what she reached for instead was my tone. So I asked her the other question, the one I had been assembling in my head since the garage. If that call had come through and the man on the other end had told me I owed $80 million instead of that I had won it, would she be standing in this kitchen at 10 o'clock at night asking me not to decide anything permanent? That was when the anger arrived, and the anger was real. She said I was reducing 7 years to a number, that I was turning her into a woman who could be priced, that she had never once in her life asked me for money. That last part was true. She never had. She had only ever stopped in front of windows and said something dismissive and walked on, and I had spent years trying to close that distance with my own 2 hands. I did not raise my voice. I told her that I had not brought the money into this. She had brought it into the garage. 3 minutes before that phone call, she had been explaining to me carefully and with evidence why our marriage was already finished, and 9 seconds after it, she was telling me we could not throw away 7 years. I had not done that to her. I had only counted it. She stood there with her coat still on and looked around the kitchen the way you look at a room you have already mentally moved out of, and then she stopped arguing, and what came next was the only fully honest thing she said all night. She told me I was a good man, and I believe she meant it. Then she said that being a good man had never been the question. She was 35 years old, and she had spent 10 of those years walking clients through rooms she would never be invited into as a guest, and every year the door had gotten a little heavier. She had come to understand that I was never going to be the person who opened it. Not because I was lazy, but because that simply was not the kind of man I was. And she had known that when she married me, and somewhere in the last 2 years, she had stopped being able to live with her own decision. Damien had money. He had a name that made people return calls. He had standing access to the exact rooms she had been waiting outside of since she was 25, and he had made it clear that the access came attached to him. Then she said the thing she most needed me to hear, which was that none of it meant she had never loved me. I sat in my own kitchen and looked at the woman I had built a life around, and I understood that she was probably telling the truth about that as well, and that it did not help me at all. Because the question in front of me was never whether love had existed in this apartment. It had. I could have shown you the room where it happened. The question was whether a love that had genuinely been real was enough to forgive a betrayal that had been planned, signed, and maintained for 49 consecutive days. I sat with that longer than I sat with anything else that night, and the answer I reached is one I still stand by. A thing that was real once does not obligate you to accept whatever someone chose to do with it afterward. I told her that in the morning I would be calling an attorney named Gregory Hale, whose name had been given to me before any of this happened, and asking him to begin a formal separation. That is the moment she stopped asking. Her face changed for the second time in 6 hours, and this change was faster than the first. Her voice dropped into something flat and businesslike, the tone she used with clients who were being unrealistic about a price, and she asked me whether I honestly believed I was going to keep that money. She reminded me that we were still legally married. A lottery ticket purchased during a marriage is marital property in this state, she said, and any attorney in this city would tell me the same thing inside of 5 minutes. She was not wrong about the law. She was, I think, entirely wrong about what she had just shown me. 40 minutes earlier, she had been crying in my kitchen about a radiator in an apartment we left 7 years ago, and now she was quoting property statutes at me without a break in her voice. Both of those women had been standing in that room the whole evening. I had simply watched the first one get put away. I did not shout at her, and I did not threaten her. I took out my phone, opened the photographs I had taken across that conference table, while Damien Kessler watched me, and could not imagine why it would ever matter, and I laid the phone flat on the counter facing her. The header, the corner with the small gray date and the name of her firm, the page with her signature on it. I told her I had already sent all 3 to Gregory Hale from the car, along with the name of the attorney she had retained, which meant there was now a record downtown with a date attached to it that neither of us controlled anymore. She looked at that phone for a long time without touching it. I told her the truth as I understood it, which was that I did not know what a court would decide. I am not a lawyer, and I was not going to stand in my own kitchen pretending I could predict a judge. What I did know was that on the day she walked into that office and signed her name, she believed she was marrying into Damien Kessler's world, and she believed I was worth exactly what I appeared to be worth. And she had put that belief into writing 7 weeks before a gas station in another county sold me a ticket. Then I said the only sentence from that night that I had planned in advance. The thing you used to leave me is the same thing that proves you left before I had anything worth staying for. I watched it land. She had walked into that office, feeling clever, feeling decisive at last, after years of hesitating, and the document she commissioned to end her marriage on her own terms had become the clearest existing evidence of when she stopped loving me and why. She asked me not to decide anything while I was angry. I told her I was not angry anymore, and that frightened her more than anything else I said that night. She was right to be frightened. Anger is a form of attachment, and a man who is furious with you is still spending himself on you. What she was looking at across that counter was a man who had finished. She wanted to know what I was going to do, not about the marriage, about them. So I told her. I was not going to hire anyone to follow either of them. I was not going to call Vivian Kessler, whose name I knew only because it was printed on a photograph in her husband's office where clients could see it and who had done nothing to me at all. I was not going to send anything to that company's board, and I was not going to spend a single dollar of $80 million making certain that Sabrina Vale never sold another property in this city. She did not believe me. I could see her waiting for the condition. There was no condition, and the reason was not that I am a better man than the situation called for. It was simpler and more selfish than that. I had spent one day learning exactly what it feels like to be on the receiving end of something planned quietly against a person who trusts you, and I had no intention of becoming fluent in it. Winning was never going to be making the two of them hurt the way I hurt on that Friday. Winning was walking out of this with the man I had been on Wednesday still intact. She stood there in her coat with her keys still in her hand and asked me the last real question she ever asked me, which was whether I could truly walk away after all these years. I told her I was not leaving because those 7 years meant nothing. I was leaving because what she did with them meant something. She saw the box on her way out. It had been sitting on that counter the entire evening, tied with the ribbon the woman in the store had let me tie myself, and she must have looked past it a dozen times while she was building her case. Now she stopped in front, and I watched her understand what it was, and I watched her understand when I had bought it. I opened the lid so she could see. The necklace she had stood in front of 3 times over 4 years, and beneath it, a card with 6 lines on it in my handwriting folded once. I did not hand it to her. I also did not use it to make her feel anything, which I could have done easily, and which some part of me wanted to do. I simply closed the lid again and left my hand flat on top of the box. And that was the moment she finally understood why I had come to that building on Friday afternoon. Not to catch her. Not because I suspected anything. Not to test her and not to make a scene in front of the people she worked with. I went there because I had just had the luckiest day of my life, and I wanted to spend the first hour of it with the person I trusted most in the world, and I could not wait until evening to see her face. I opened the door and she walked out. $80 million did not end my marriage. What I saw through that glass ended it. The ticket only made certain I learned the truth before I handed over the rest of my life to a woman who had already chosen a future without me in it. None of what followed was my doing, and I want that understood because people always assume there was a plan. Vivian Kessler filed in the 2nd month. Nobody needed to tell her. There had been 11 people on that floor at 4:45 on a Friday afternoon, and not all of them were willing to keep looking at their screens forever. The board opened an internal review of relationships between senior leadership and staff, and Damien left his position with a press release that ran 2 sentences, both of them polite. I read it on my phone in a waiting room and felt almost nothing, which surprised me more than anger would have. Sabrina lost the portfolio. 3 buildings she had chased for 14 months, the largest thing she had ever been close to, withdrawn without much explanation. In high-end real estate, what is actually being bought and sold is not the property. It is the credibility of the person standing beside it. Damien had promised to open that door for her. Damien no longer had a door. Claire Bennett resigned before the review began, not after. She was the only person in that building who tried to stop me, and she was the only one who paid for her own conscience with her own job. I found that out 3 months later entirely by accident, standing behind her in a checkout line at a grocery store. She recognized me first and went red to her ears and started apologizing, which I have thought about ever since because she was the one human being in that building with nothing to apologize for. I did not offer her money. I understood that money would have turned her decency into something that had been purchased, and it deserved better than that. Instead, I asked her what she would do if money were not a factor, and she told me she had left an architecture program in her 2nd year when her mother got sick and had never found a way back to it. The following spring, her tuition was covered by a newly established education fund. It carries my father's name. He was a man who forgot my face before the end, but who never once on any day of his life forgot how to be decent to a stranger, and it seemed right that whatever he left in me should end up somewhere like that. Claire does not know who is behind it. I would like it to stay that way. If there is anything worth carrying out of all this, it is not the size of the number. It is that we usually find out who someone truly is at the exact moment their circumstances change, and that we cannot control when that moment arrives. Only what we do with what it shows us. Believe what people do over what they explain. 7 good years are worth honoring, but they are not a debt that obligates you to a bad future. And the strongest thing you will ever do is walk away without becoming the person who hurt you. If any of that landed with you, subscribe and stay with us because there are more stories like this one waiting, and they are better with you here. I am not a wealthy man because $80 million arrived on a Thursday night. I am a wealthy man because I found out exactly who I was when nobody was left in the room to watch.